Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know we love digging into these data sets, and today's is really interesting. We're going to do a deep dive into the population story of Eritrea.
Hmm.
And, looking at the data you sent over, there are some really fascinating trends. Like right off the bat, the sheer population growth is kind of mind-blowing. You're looking at a country that had less than 1 million people in the mid-20th century, and it's projected to have nearly 5 million by 2050.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible when you see the numbers laid out like that. In 1955, Eritrea's population was just a little under 900,000, to be exact, about 886,000. But then fast forward to 2025, and that number jumps to an estimated 3.6 million.
That's a huge increase, like more than quadrupled in just 70 years. So what's driving that? Is it just like a higher birth rate, or are there other factors at play?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a bit of a mix, but one of the key factors is the fertility rate. If you look back in 1980, the average woman in Eritrea was having over 6 children. But by 2025, that number is projected to drop to around 3.6 children per woman, and even lower to 2.6 by 2050.
Wow, 6 children per woman.
Mm.
That's a lot. So what caused such a dramatic drop?
Well, there are a bunch of factors, but one of the big ones is urbanization. As societies develop and people move to cities, you tend to see family sizes shrinking. In urban areas, raising a large family can be more expensive, and there's often a shift in priorities toward things like education and careers. So in Eritrea, we're seeing that happen as more and more people move to urban areas.
Right, so it's not just about births, it's about like a fundamental change in Eritrean society.
Absolutely. And there's another factor that's kind of tied to this change, and that's life expectancy. It's actually increasing. By 2025, the average Eritrean is projected to live to almost 69 years old.
That's a pretty big jump in lifespan. So
Yep.
what do you think is contributing to that?
Well, it's probably a combination of things,
Mm.
improvements in healthcare, sanitation, overall living conditions. All these things are likely playing a role.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of big shifts, let's talk about urbanization because the data really shows just how drastically Eritrea's population is moving from rural areas to cities.
Oh, yeah, it's pretty amazing. Back in 1955, only about 12% of Eritreans lived in urban areas. But get this, by 2025, that number is expected to shoot up to almost 75%.
Whoa. So you're saying a country that was largely rural is becoming predominantly urban in basically a lifetime.
Yeah, it's a huge transformation.
So what kind of challenges does that kind of rapid urbanization create?
Well, I mean, just think about the pressure it puts on infrastructure and resources. Suddenly, you need to provide housing, transportation, and job opportunities for millions of new urban residents.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of growth. We're talking about going from just over 100,000 urban dwellers in 1955 to over 2.5 million in 2025.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling, and it just really highlights the scale of the changes happening within Eritrea. This rapid urbanization definitely brings challenges, but it also presents opportunities for things like economic development and modernization. It's really kind of a pivotal moment for them.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? All this growth and opportunity, but also a lot of pressure to adapt to these rapid changes.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding these population trends is so important. It's not just about knowing the numbers, it's about understanding what those numbers mean for all these different aspects of society.
Right, it paints a much clearer picture. Okay, so speaking of which, there's another aspect of Eritrea's population story that I'm really curious about, and that's the migrants net figure in the data. Can you explain what that means and how it plays into this whole picture?
Sure, yeah. So migrants net basically tells you the balance between people moving into and out of a country. And if it's negative, which it is for Eritrea in certain periods, that means more people are leaving than arriving.
So even though the overall population is growing, there's also this undercurrent of people leaving the country. Why is that?
Well, a lot of times it's driven by things like economic hardship or political instability. People are looking for better opportunities or a safer life elsewhere.
So we're seeing a population that's growing, but also one where a significant portion feels like they need to seek opportunities elsewhere. And that has some big implications for the country's future, right?
Oh, absolutely. It can lead to a drain on the workforce, especially in certain specialized fields. And while the money's sent back by immigrants, the remittances can provide a boost to the economy, it also speaks to the challenges people are facing and the tough choices they're making.
Yeah, it really adds another layer of complexity to the whole picture. You've got this population that's growing, but at the same time, you have this portion of the population who feels like they need to leave to find opportunities. It just shows that population trends are never simple. Yeah, for sure. And this whole trend of rapid urbanization brings us to another interesting point you brought up in the data, and that's population density. Like, if you think about it, Eritrea is about the size of Pennsylvania. So imagine squeezing all those people into one U.S. state.
That's a great analogy. It really puts things into perspective. And with a projected population of 3.6 million in 2025, you're looking at a density of about 36 people per square kilometer.
Okay, so that doesn't sound too crowded, but you mentioned earlier that this density is increasing, right?
Exactly. As more and more people move from those rural areas to the cities, that density is only going to continue to go up. So it's definitely something urban planners need to consider. I mean, how do you plan for sustainable growth with that kind of population density increase?
Yeah, it's like this giant
Yeah.
puzzle, figuring out how to accommodate all these changes and make sure everyone has a decent quality of life.
I know, right? It's a
Yeah.
huge challenge. And speaking of quality of life, one of the most important statistics we have is the infant mortality rate. In Eritrea, it's projected to be around 26 deaths per 1,000 live births in 2025.
So that means for every 1,000 babies born, 26 of them don't make it to their first birthday. That's still pretty high, but I'm guessing it's an improvement from the past.
You're right, it is. Infant mortality is a really sensitive indicator of a country's overall healthcare situation. And the fact that Eritrea has made progress in reducing this rate is definitely a good sign. It's probably due to things like better maternal and child healthcare services, as well as improvements in things like nutrition and sanitation.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, any improvement in infant mortality is a huge win. It really shows that investments in healthcare are making a difference, although obviously there's still work to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to remember that while we often focus on these big population numbers, each data point actually represents real people and real families. There's a human story behind every single statistic.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers and forget that we're talking about real lives here.
Yeah.
So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Eritrea's impressive population growth, the massive shift towards urbanization, the challenges of migration, and the improvements in infant mortality. But, like, what does all this mean for Eritrea's future? What's the takeaway here?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, Eritrea is at a crossroads. It's experiencing these huge demographic shifts while also trying to achieve things like economic development and stability. So how it manages all these trends is going to have a huge impact on its future.
So it sounds like you're saying there's both a lot of potential and a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this growing dynamic population could be a huge asset if the right conditions are in place. But they're going to need to manage that rapid urbanization, make sure there are opportunities for everyone, and address the root causes of migration. Those are going to be key factors.
Yeah, it's like watching a wave building. You can see all this power and energy, but the way that energy is channeled is going to determine what happens next.
That's a perfect analogy. And speaking of the bigger picture, let's zoom out for a second and think about where Eritrea stands globally. In 2025, it's projected to be the 132nd most populous country in the world.
So it's not a demographic giant by any means, but still a significant player in its region. What does that mean in terms of its global impact?
Well, to put it in perspective, Eritrea's population represents about 0.04% of the total global population. That might not sound like much, but every fraction of a percent represents millions of individuals. And as we've seen, even a country with a relatively small population can experience massive demographic shifts with huge consequences.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how interconnected everything is. We've got fertility rates, urbanization, migration patterns, life expectancy, even something as seemingly simple as population density. They're all threads in this big tapestry, shaping Eritrea's present and future.
That's a great way to put it. It's not just about looking at these statistics in isolation. It's about understanding how they all fit together and create this really complex and constantly evolving picture of a society.
It's fascinating, right? And for a country like Eritrea, a country that has seen so much change in such a short amount of time, it feels like understanding these connections is crucial for navigating the future. It's like we're holding this key that unlocks these secrets hidden in the numbers.
Exactly. And more we understand those secrets, the more we can appreciate how complex the human experience really is. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Eritrea's population story, is there like one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to walk away with?
I think for me, it's the realization of just how much Eritrea's population is changing. It's not just about the total number of people. It's about that shift from rural to urban, the whole migration thing, and the improvements in healthcare we see reflected in things like infant mortality. It's a super dynamic situation with a ton of moving pieces.
That's a great point. It really highlights how population trends are never simple. They're always intertwined and evolving, and they have this huge impact on shaping the social, economic, and even political landscape of a country. And honestly, that's what makes it so fascinating to study. It's like this window into the heart of human society.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that those numbers aren't just abstract figures. They represent real people, real lives, dreams, the whole deal. And by understanding these trends, we can get a better sense of the human stories behind the data.
For sure. And, it also reminds us that even small numbers can have a big impact. Eritrea's population may only be a tiny fraction of the global total, but the changes happening there have huge consequences for both the country and its people. Thinking bigger picture here, what are some of the insights we can get from Eritrea's story?
Well, for one thing, it shows just how powerful demographics can be in reshaping a nation. Eritrea's rapid urbanization, shifting fertility rates, and those migration patterns, they're all forces that are literally changing the face of the country. It also shows us how important it is to understand these population dynamics if we want to make smart policies, things related to urban planning, resource management, education, healthcare, the whole nine yards.
Couldn't agree more. I think Eritrea's experience is a valuable lesson for other countries that are dealing with similar demographic changes, especially in the developing world. It's like a case study in adapting and showing how a nation can navigate these big shifts.
It sounds like Eritrea's future really depends on how well it can manage these demographic changes and create opportunities for its growing population.
It definitely does. And while it's impossible to predict the future, these population trends give us some clues about the potential challenges and opportunities they'll face. Eritrea's story is still unfolding, and it'll be fascinating to see what happens next.
Well said. It's a good reminder that demographics are never just about the numbers. They're about people, their lives, and the decisions they make. We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the complex and ever-changing population story of Eritrea.
And maybe even sparked your curiosity to explore the incredible diversity and dynamics of populations around the world. Thanks for joining us.